If a civil war happened in the near future in the US, would it benefit the right wing? I think it's clear that it would cause a lot of death, starvation, disease. Parents would have to watch their children suffering and dying. Husbands their wives, children their parents. The level of suffering would be unprecedented. People today aren't prepared for this kind of chaos. They're not prepared to pay this kind of price for political victory. And part of winning a civil war is having popular support. So if you go in callously thinking about political victory and you have a mind to, if you privately planned on being part of the red forces or the rebel forces in this scenario, if you would plan to take out the power grid, disrupt food supplies, cut railroad lines, things like that, how would the general public look at you? If you don't care about the cost, you don't care about the suffering, how would they look at you? Because if they don't support you, you're not going to have logistical support, you're not going to win. And anything that you get at the end of the day as a concession from the establishment, or if somehow you replaced the entire establishment, would that be lasting if the people thought that you were heartless, callous? It is the world we're living in. People have the sentiments that they do. Most people are not ready for this kind of sacrifice. Just something to note before looking at particular strategic issues for the right. So, many people think that the right wing would obviously win because they control most of the land, they control most of the guns, they have most of the former military personnel, and they have most active military personnel. But you have to remember, with the military, the higher up the chain of command you go, the more establishment you are. Not necessarily the more left wing, but not every person who would vote Republican is willing to go against the chain of command, go against their orders for their ideological commitments. And how is the conflict portrayed? That has to do with communication. When it first begins, there's a period of time where it's uncertain if it's simply domestic terrorism or if it's a civil war. Remember back to 2011, with the beginning of the Syrian civil war, people weren't sure what to call it. Was this a civil war? Was this an insurgent terrorist force? The same would apply in America. People wouldn't just know immediately that a civil war is happening and they would know who to side with. No, in all likelihood, all the major media outlets would look at whoever was initiating force as terrorists, and that's the impression that most military personnel would have of the situation. The context in which suddenly a full-scale civil war is happening and everyone knows that a civil war is happening, and all of the military personnel could then make an evaluation, will I support the rebels or the establishment? That doesn't happen until the war is already on. So you won't have the military support at all in the beginning, is what I'm saying. And later on, when more variables are known, where is the information coming from that military people are getting? It's coming from their chain of command. And so it will be controlled. And these people are masters, and I mean the establishment, masters of propaganda, psychology, psychological warfare. It's very unlikely that the right wing, in my opinion, is going to have the support of the military generally. And remember, if they do have the support of some military personnel, they're not going to have the support of the higher ups, meaning they're not going to have the high-level communications and logistical tools that the military possesses. Those things are controlled, those resources are controlled by people at the top of the hierarchy. You might have isolated instances, soldiers driving their tanks off the base to go join the rebels. Things like that likely would happen. But, people are generally pretty pro-establishment in any context. People are generally pretty authoritarian, especially military people. And if you don't have military experience, which I do, you don't know the kind of conditioning that people go through. Former military is a different concern, but anyway, that's just a point on the military issue. A lot of people think that's the clincher, that the military is generally right-wing, so they would support the right wing. But that confuses the issue of the beginning of the conflict. Is it known that a civil war is happening? Is it known what the motivations of the rebels even are? Or is the information being filtered through media propaganda, military intelligence that's twisting facts? There's a big fog of war component, and that's most of these points that I'm going to go through. The fog of war component is not being factored into some of the analyses that I've seen, like John Mark's analysis. In many regards, it's numerically accurate, right? It points to possible paths towards victory, but it is not considering all the factors. And you have to remember, when it comes to these sensitive security issues, the establishment puts out disinformation. So you have to look at this stuff with a skeptical eye. Are you really an expert to the point where you know this kind of analysis is 100% accurate, or is it leaving some critical details out? I suggest it is leaving critical details out, particularly regarding coordination, communication, modeling, and definition. So coordination, how does the right wing coordinate in the event of this conflict? In the beginning, people who, it's often talked about there will be like a gun grab. The left wing is constitutionally determined to piss off the right, and eventually they'll overreach somehow, and the right wing will react, but they won't react all in concert. They're not, ants in a colony. They're individuals making decisions based on their own self-interest at any given point in time. So how do you coordinate the initiation of force? Wherever it first occurs, it's going to be looked at as domestic terrorism. The early adopters of this strategy are risking a lot. Now, once things are at a certain level, then it becomes less of a risk for someone to join the rebel forces. As their victory becomes more likely or is esteemed to be more likely. But that relates to the communication issue as well, because most of the communications that ordinary people receive will be coming from the establishment. The right-wing militias and, revolutionary forces won't be able to distribute propaganda except through like leaflets and things like that, and that'll be fairly limited. So what I'm saying is most people will have the perception that the establishment is going to win and that the revolutionaries are terrorists and white supremacists and evil people. So you will be fighting that battle. I don't think the coordination of right-wing people just happens. We're not psychically connected in an obvious way. So the initiation of force, also that same factor at the end, right? If, say, John Mark gets his way and you get the establishment to replace the U.S. Constitution with the Proprietarian Constitution, does most of the right wing see that as a victory condition? Because they have to be coordinated in accepting the settlement that happens at the end of the war. They have to accept that the war is over. So you really need a chain of command. You really need, some kind of leadership for this function to be carried out, for the beginning and the end of the war to even make sense. And then in the middle of the war, for resources to be redistributed, for forces to be allocated, all of that coordination. How is it happening? What are the communication technologies you use? And what communication technologies do you have that the government or the establishment can't simply suppress? Very few resources, I think, and few people are familiar with these techniques. If you think you could use some form of shortwave radio or whatever it is you think you could use, very few people have access to that sort of technology and the skills to actually use it. So what's the technology of coordinating these forces? And then what's the actual human capital? What's the hierarchy that you're using? How do you coordinate these people? An important thing to note is that leadership quality people are very few in number. And most of the people on the right wing with leadership potential already have a following. They're already politically active. And this is something that I've discussed with Kurt, and he acknowledges the leaders of this kind of movement, of the right wing in a civil war, if that would happen, the leaders are the people that we know today as right-wing leaders, the people who have a presence online, who have a following. Now, those people are clearly known by the government, and in the event of a civil war, they would all be assassinated. Do you think they can't carry out assassinations? No, of course they can. They're not so you do not want to assume incompetence on the part of your enemy. That's like rule 1 of warfare generally. You want to assume that you're being given disinformation first and then check it carefully to see if maybe it's accurate. Like a lot of right-wing people see the impossibility of an electoral victory down the line, and they want something. They want a solution, and they see someone like John Mark come out with his analysis, and they say, yes, yes, without critically analyzing it. You have to remember these basic principles of warfare. Don't assume your enemy is incompetent. Don't assume the information that you're getting is fully accurate. Maybe it's serving someone else's interests. So the leaders would be killed. If you're a right-wing leader, if you're in communication with Kurt Doolittle, don't expect commands from the proprietarians. Don't expect, help from your brothers in arms on the fringe right wing. Expect SWAT teams, expect drone strikes, expect to be killed. They know who you are. They know where you live. They know everything about you. If you follow Kurt, I'm talking about the people who are politically active. And if you look at the training material for people, there's a job in the Army. I forget what the MOS is or what the job title is specifically, but it's about basically concentration camps, right? The FEMA camps, things like that. In the event of a national emergency, people will be grouped into these camps. And they are the training material is there for them to target potential revolutionaries, to target people who have radical thoughts, and to isolate them, get rid of them. So that same school of thought is around now. They know all of the fringe people, the really active people are very small in number. The total number of people that I know operate the spheres similar to where I operate online. Total number of active people is somewhere in the neighborhood, maybe of 100,000. The really active, well-informed people. The government can kill 100,000 people. They can track 100,000 people. This is their land. They have everything they need to cut the head off the snake early. So coordination is a big difficulty because of that. The leadership will be killed. You don't have the technology to coordinate. And that, obviously ties in with communication. How are you communicating, and how is your message being communicated to the public? Leaflets, like how do you propagandize? How do you gain popular support? People don't just know what's happening. They know because someone's telling them what's happening. And the establishment has all of the communication networks, and the fringe right wing would have none. You don't want to you don't want to err on the side of optimism and assume that the right wing generally, meaning every man and woman who would, voted for Donald Trump, you don't want to assume that they are so firmly committed to an as yet undefined right-wing ideology. They're obviously not committed to proprietarianism. They're committed to who knows what. It's not exactly clear. But you don't want to assume they're so committed that you'd get these millions and millions of people just joining the revolution, sacrificing their own lives and safety and going against the government. Like, the level of commitment is unlikely to be that high. And Kurt obviously knows this. You'll have a small number of people, thousands maybe, involved in such a revolutionary scenario. If you think that's sufficient, I think you're just being naive. Modeling, this has to do with that fog of war. So if you can't coordinate and communicate, how do you know what's happening? How do you know that the war is even still on? How do you know where to go? Like, there's just, you have individual terrorists going around, blowing up railroad lines and bridges. That's all that you can effectively do. You can disrupt the activity of the establishment, but the military has tech that they don't need railroad lines and the internet. They have their own internet. They have their own communications networks that you can't touch, that you cannot destroy. So the enemy won't be harmed ultimately. And there are contingencies like the FEMA camps for the general population. Just something to consider. And this definition issue is a critical one. John Mark likes to conflate the right wing generally with proprietarianism. Like, this right wing revolt will happen, the Civil War will happen, the right wing, Red America will win, and then there'll be an opportunity for political reformulation. They can throw out the Constitution, bring in the proprietarian Constitution, bring in the proprietarian order. But people aren't signing up for that with a right-wing revolution. Most likely, you're going to get some right-wing demagogue who's really just a vehicle for the establishment anyway. Those are the people who are able to reach the masses, the people who have the logistical support of the establishment. They control the information, they control the perception of who is right-wing and who's not right-wing. You don't just know that someone's right-wing because they claim to be. You'll have someone like Donald Trump, some demagogic figure, claiming to be the savior. And if the establishment wants the right wing to win this Civil War scenario, if they want the right wing to feel that they've won, they'll have that kind of figure ready, and they'll have a political reformulation ready that won't ultimately harm their interests. The elites are global. You're not going to destabilize their power. Their power is really not fathomable to most people. They have billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, resources all over the world. You don't want to waste your time planning for a civil war. You don't want... Hopefully some of this made sense to you. Most people don't listen critically. Most people are emotionally invested and they think like idiots, right? Most people do not think critically about these sorts of things, about strategic things. So hopefully you were able to really think about it, because your future might depend on your perception of this issue. And, specifically, I don't support talking about civil war. I don't support thinking about civil war. I don't support crafting political strategies that hinge upon a successful civil war. Instead, I put forward that we ought to, conservative people, traditional-minded people ought to establish networks, legal networks now, educational institutions now, schools, specifically schools, communication networks, so like social media, and communities. Those all can be established currently. I've made steps on my part to contribute to those things. But of course, people are prone to be distracted by false collectivizing, by saying you're part of this huge right-wing struggle and let's focus on this national thing instead of changing your individual life. Like, be realistic. You have two options. Have faith in a mass civil war that's going to change everything with one, dramatic action, or like actually start living in a different way, maybe move with people who share your values, engage in academic research. Like, how did the left come to prominence? Part of it was the Frankfurt School. Institutions like that are actually relevant. They control the academia, they control the education of the youth. Those sorts of things matter. So you could get involved in that. You could start a school. You could start a community with like-minded people. But that would mean changing your habits, giving up your addictions, working in your individual life, right? It's have faith in this big dramatic event or change your life and work hard. Now, people don't like this. They don't like seeing that they are personally responsible. You have to remember, like, the world is going to hell in a lot of ways, but the whole world isn't. A lot of the world is. You have to put yourself in a situation where you will be okay. And you want to put your community in that kind of situation. That means planning. So you do want to prepare, to plan for violent events. You want to be in a good situation, but you don't want to depend on some big, final, dramatic struggle. You want to struggle here and now and every day, and that's the path to victory. That's just a general rule in life. If you have two options, one is quick and dirty and dramatic and satisfying intuitively, and you have one that's like tedious and you have to keep going back to it, likely this one is going to lead to prosperity. This one will lead to a short-term high and long-term unproductivity. So that's about what I wanted to say. I think it's worth noting that I have made videos against propertarianism at an ideological level before. I think my critiques still stand. And I did offer to debate anyone from the propertarian camp. That first video I made got over 10,000 views. And no one, not a single person who considers themselves a propertarian, offered to debate me. I made the challenge. No one took me up on it. I think because they see that they would lose. Even Kurt knows that he would lose. Kurt doesn't have a solution to this coordination issue, to all of the leadership being assassinated right in the beginning. I've talked to him personally, in person. I've talked to him about this issue, and he doesn't have a solution. He says, well, that's why we just have to act together all at once quickly. That's what he told me. Well, how are you going to coordinate people to act all at once and everybody jump on board this boat, this suicidal boat of revolution and civil war? Anyway, it's ridiculous. So Kurt doesn't have a solution to that. People on the propertarian side can't debate my points. If somebody out there would like to, I'm still open to it. But don't be fooled by this Civil War talk. It's not productive. Now, you can prepare, right? You can plan for a violent conflict in the future. In fact, you should. You should live somewhere safe. You should have food stockpiled. You should have ammunition. You should have networks of people that could convert into defensive networks if need be. But you shouldn't hang your hat on this kind of contingency. You don't want your strategy to depend on something out of your hands. You want to take control of it. So that's why I have a school that I'm starting. It's online. It's just a philosophy school currently, but I think that's the core, and it's a matter of motivating people to get involved. I don't know exactly how to do that, but hey, that's the way it works. You can get a lot of views and a lot of popular support for promising big, dramatic, harmful things. But when you go out and promote, you have to work hard, you have to study, you have to read a book, you have to, get out of your destructive habits, then you don't get such a warm reception. That's human nature. So that's what you're up against, and it's you as an individual. Are you putting your work into something real? If you want to support my work, you can contact me, you can get involved. We have a website. I still haven't made a video talking about it. I will soon, but when I'm ready. But yeah, you can talk to me. You can come on my Discord. support me on Patreon. I would like to not just have this website, but also a real school somewhere. I think that's a productive step that's achievable, that doesn't require even all that much initial investment. It's something that we can do. But if you want to go blow up railroad lines and blow up bridges and hope for revolution, you do you, but I don't think it's going to pan out. So thank you for listening.